Long absent from his native island, Corsican Antoine, François Cluzet, brings his 17-year-old daughter Luna, along with his best friend Laurent and his 18-year-old daughter Marie, to the family nest in the summer. When the girls realize that in Corsica they can either be bored at home or swim and party at night beach discos, they go in search of male company. But while Marie is looking for peers, Luna has her eye on Laurent. One day, during a drunken night swim, the girl's cheeky flirtation with a man escalates into sex on the beach. The next day, Luna decides she is head over heels in love, and a dazed Laurent is ashamed and terrified of the wrath of Antoine, who has a hunting rifle. French comedies were often distributed in the Soviet Union, but the films that the famous French director and producer Claude Berry, Asterix and Obelix vs. Caesar, good grief, made in the 1970s, were not allowed into our country. Well, how could the Soviet censors could screen, say, a 1972 film Sex Shop, which tells the story of a bookstore owner who, to save his business, turns the institution into a sex shop and plunges into a comically awkward study of kinky sex. The 1977 picture This Awkward Moment was not as horny, but it was also very explicit and mixed comedic and tragic motifs. The main theme of both productions was the so-called male panic, the feeling that the sexual revolution and the social changes associated with it, in particular, the simplification and spread of divorce, had turned men from masters of life into helpless slaves to women's whims. Whether the whims of wives, daughters, or pushy mistresses. Berry passed away in 2009, and a few years later his son, producer Tom Langman, an Oscar winner for producing The Artist, decided to remind viewers of one of his father's most provocative films by directing a modern remake of This Awkward Moment. The director is Jean-François Richet, Assault on the 13th, who has always worked on crime films. The screenplay is by Lisa Azuelos, who has written the remake with Richet. The latter, despite her not at all youthful age, is considered a connoisseur of youth themes because she invented and directed the famous school romantic film Lol Laughing in France and then directed the American remake of that picture Summer. Classmates. Love. The result is a rather curious tragicomic film whose value lies not so much in how engaging and entertaining it is in the theater, but in how long the questions it poses can't get the audience out of their heads. Take, for example, his central moral dilemma. Is it right for a high school girl to impose herself on her father's friend in bed, and is it right for a man who is almost her uncle to accept this gift? Instinctively we sense that something is wrong, but what is it? And by what moral standards are these actions to be judged? And if the heroes are wrong, how serious is their crime? In the old days it was easy to answer such questions, but now, in 21st century Europe, there is not even the smell of clarity and certainty. These and other problems addressed in the film provide ample material for self-reflection and discussion with friends. As for how entertaining the film is, it's not all good, since This Awkward Moment balances drama and comedy, and sometimes ends up being neither fish nor meat. The jokes and funny scenes in the movie are not enough to make you laugh all the time, and they often only evoke chuckles rather than laughter. The degree of drama is not understood above the heat mark. The comedic bias of the film softens the scenes in which passions, in theory, should boil and pour over the edge. What you can't fault in the film is the acting of Klaus and Castle, pros are pros. And the character of Lola Lands. This is not the kind of movie that makes sense to watch for erotic scenes, as there is relatively little eroticism in This Awkward Moment. But the explicit portions that are in the film turned out to be very beautiful and seductive. And it's nice that it's not erotica for the sake of erotica, but erotica for the sake of the story. The better the main character looks in a swimsuit and without it, the easier, if not to justify, to understand a man who succumbs to her charms. Castle, in turn, also looks very decent, a lot more athletic than the protagonist of the Tate Berry, and therefore the feelings of the moon in the remake is more believable than in the original. In general, if the previous film was a kind of farcical parable that illustrates its creator's views of the world but does not pretend to psychological validity, the new This Awkward Moment tells a story that is almost believable. Especially if you watch the picture through a man's eyes. Despite the participation of Lisa Azuelos, this is still a predominantly male film about men's anxieties, fears, worries, and about the role that female squiggles play in all this. Translated with www.depl.com/translator, free version.